So I still very much felt that my dissertation was going to demonstrate that grading was important. I was wrong. And why I was wrong was because I started researching, and the little that existed at that time. So we're talking 2007 through 2009, when I first started my dissertation. What little existed talked about the role of the teacher and having to judge the student and also offering feedback, and how that doesn't really match. So I talked about that a lot. What I ended up having to study later, and I did quite a bit of research on the schools that did publish like what their philosophies were and such. I found that nobody agrees on what grading is, that even in my school, there were 3 algebra teachers in my previous school, and none of us had the same grading philosophies. So an A in my class had nothing to do with an A in somebody else's class. So if we had a student graduating from that school with all A's, depending on the teachers they had, their preparation was different. So what exactly does a grade give you except an artificial sense of mastery? And so I started shifting from, well, if grades don't matter, because they don't, because people make up whatever they want to about what grades are. And grading inflation was a thing then, because after No Child Left Behind, something started happening where you couldn't give grades less than 50 in a lot of schools, especially private schools. So every time a student got a 0 or didn't take an assessment, you had to put a 50 in there. And GPAs in the 90s, the graduating or entering college GPA, I don't remember which one it was because it's been a while and my data is a little jumbled, but it was something like 3.84. And now it's like 3.95. So what, everybody's a straight A student? Those are the kinds of things where I'm like, sure, everybody could be a straight A student, but it doesn't mean anything. And that's where I got to the point where grades don't mean anything. I want you to show me what that looks like for you. What were you focused on? I want my students, if I ask my students, what did you learn in my classes? I want them to say like, oh, in your class for this game design with Scratch, I was trying to focus on character creation because I'm interested in creating role-playing games. And so what I learned was this. That is a better answer than I got an A. And so I don't believe in grades. Grades tell me absolutely nothing about the individual that's learning, whereas I want my students to have a narrative behind what they do and their assessment of themselves. I want them to be able to explain what it is that they did in my classroom, not just say like, oh, I did great, I got an A. They mean nothing at all. They literally just are there to make somebody happy. Sometimes it's parents, sometimes it's students. And I remember telling a student when I was moving from one school to another where I said, I'm going to a school that's going great less in the next 5 years. And she said, then how am I supposed to know what my worth is? And I felt we had missed it. What was it that made you think that your worth was based on a grade? That broke me in a lot of ways. And I remember going to the head of that division. I was in a different division there, but I said, I just got this comment from a student. And I think it's important that you know, because we're failing our students if they think their worth is based on a grade. A really good school where they're very, very competitive, and yet elementary school gives no grades at all. Middle school is going gradeless. And actually the upper school, some classes are already gradeless. And we're still competitive. So what's the point? Why is it that we need to continue to work on saying, but grades are important? They're not.
So if somebody is listening to either going gradeless or just like your general approach or philosophy to education, and they're like, yes, this sounds great, but I have a question about blank. What's some of the typical questions that teachers have?
So I've had quite a bit of questions in a lot of different circles. And recently I had a conversation with a parent, not from my school. And he said, but A's were my thing. Like I wanted to get an A and that's how I became so successful. You know, they're in medicine and top of their game. And I said, but what if you could have focused on your growth? Would that have made it less competitive? Because you're competing against yourself anyway. If you're a competitive person, you're going to want to be better. I still want to beat my top score in every game. I'm just not trying to beat somebody else's score.
Right.
And typically that makes me a lot better than if I was focusing on somebody else, because my height score might actually be better than trying to beat somebody else's. It's just a way to refocus what we are thinking about as success. And I also think grades are empty. We are dismissing a whole lot of people because of their average performance, and I say that in quotations because you're listening and not seeing me, but average performance is actually average to you because you haven't explored what makes that particular person excellent. It tells me that you haven't taken the time to work with that student to be their best self. And I do not care about what your C or A or B means. I care about what does that student see as their success. And I want everybody to understand their successes. Because in the real world, sure, there's some who were academically gifted who are doing phenomenal things, but there are some who have been labeled as average who are doing amazing things. It does not matter. Your grades do not matter. You can be amazing with a C, and I do not care. Or an F. Who cares if you failed something? In my class, you wouldn't have failed because I don't have that. You fail if you don't do things. And none of my students just not do things. We have to change the focus so that everybody can learn to express themselves individually, so that I can express who I am as a human being rather than who you want me to be.
So one of the counter arguments that I've heard from other people when I talk about grades, similar to what you're just talking about, they've said stuff like, yeah, well, I want to make sure that my pilot got an A on landing a plane, or that my surgeon is really good at understanding anatomy, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious, like, how do you respond to people like that who pose those responses?
That there's a ton of research that shows that the people who got the A's are not the actual people who have done exceptional work to figure out different methodologies. Part of the problem and part of the research, and I don't have the quotations with me right now, and this is easily found if you do some research. Somebody who's gotten an A doesn't usually go beyond that A. Somebody who's struggling usually goes way beyond what they need to in order to succeed. So if you're looking for somebody who's going to cure cancer, a lot of those people are not your A people. Some of them are, but a lot of those people are the people that can see beyond, that can look at problems different ways, which is something that you learn when you struggle. So no, I don't care if my surgeon is the A student. I care that my surgeon is the person that's qualified to perform that surgery. And if they are board certified, they are qualified. I care that they have learned my case. They know me as an individual. And specifically because I've had so many instances where I've had difficulty with a doctor actually following what I'm saying rather than what it's showing on the screen. I'll give myself as an example here. When I break things, my joints and my bones and whatever, I don't swell, which means that when you do x-rays, you don't get the typical, oh yes, there's a fracture, because the swelling and the fluid and all that stuff matters when they're doing those kinds of diagnosis. So I actually ended up having to wait over 6 months for my tendon in my elbow to be repaired. I knew I couldn't hold on to a purse, but I wasn't displaying what others display when they've torn a tendon because my pain threshold is high. So I was just like, hey, it hurts. I can't actually even hold my purse. And they're like, oh, it's not broken. Let's do PT. And I was like, it's not working. There's no change. So it took 6 months for them to even let me get into an MRI machine just to find out I had torn a tendon in my elbow, which is now attached with metal clips. That's happened multiple times. I want the surgeon and the doctor who's going to listen, who's going to say, oh, let me look at your history, which then happened with another doctor who I said, can you just look at my notes? Just look at these last 3 surgeries and then we can talk. I want the people who will do that rather than the ones who go like, but you're not that case, because they're looking at average cases. They're looking at what those rules they have to follow are to be able to make a diagnosis.
Right.
That's not the doctor I want. I want the doctor who's going to look at me as the patient, the individual, my history, and then make recommendation. I mean, obviously, I want a pilot who can land a plane, but if they have a license, they can land a plane. Again, those are non-arguments in my book because there's so much and so much discrimination in the medical world too. Mm-hmm. That people aren't really aware of. You know, it's the same thing as like the thing that reads your pulse can read yours and mine because I am lighter skinned, even though I'm not white. But a Black person's pulse might not be read correctly because it doesn't see the black skin, the brown skin. Like, that's all discrimination because those are the only ones available in the market, and that's what every hospital uses. I want the doctor who's going to say that doesn't work because these things. I want the people who can think through. I want the people who can navigate the other. And that means somebody who can say, that didn't work, so let me try this other thing. And that comes with struggle. And that's one of the reasons why I think computer science is important. There is no computer scientist programmer in the world who will say, like, I am an expert. I still haven't met anybody. And maybe there are some who say, I'm an expert in coding. Well, everybody I've met will say, I'm just okay, or I'm still learning, or my code is always broken. They'll say, like, nothing has ever worked on the first try.
Yeah.
Because nothing ever does. You forget the comma there or the semicolon or whatever, and it doesn't work. And you forget to test your code and write 300 lines of code, which I've done, and it's a bad idea.
Yep.
Because then how do you find your error? It's one of those things where computer science is a really safe place to make mistakes. And it teaches our students so much more than this is a loop, because it teaches our students that it might not have worked on the first try, but maybe on the 10th try it did. And I think that that's important because those are the students who are going to be excellent doctors and lawyers and accountants and physicians and whatever, because they're going to look at things in a broader sense. And they're going to look at the people individually. If we teach our students as individuals, they're going to look at us as individuals when we go to their offices and when we ask them for help.
Yeah, I like that. I hope listeners who are trying to make similar arguments against grades will also listen to those examples and be able to use that with administrators who might be reluctant with removing grades or whatever, or grading based on participation rather than product, etc. So yeah, thank you for giving those.
This excerpt of the CSTA podcast is from episode number 80, which is titled Individualized Learning Without Grades with Sofía De Jesús.